Hi, my name is Riley Zimmerman, and today I'm going to be doing my capstone presentation over teaching subject matter to diverse learners. So first I'm going to start out with my questions. How do students learn differently? How should diversity in abilities influence the ways in which a teacher practices her craft? How can I effectively teach subject matter to all students? And how do students best learn subject matter? Based off these questions, I developed my competency statement of I am competent at teaching a diverse group of students by using multiple teaching strategies and differentiation to engage students with all abilities. When I say diverse, I'm just acknowledging the range of learning needs and background experiences of my students. So from that competency statement, I would like to start off with my evidence number 1, which is my very first lesson plan from Teach 297A in the kindergarten classroom. And it was a reading lesson over the Wonders curriculum. And our essential question that week was, what do good citizens do? In this lesson, we read a story called Hen Hears Gossip. And we read the story, and then we talked about how each animal in the story gossiped. Then the students were sent back to their seats to draw a picture of an animal of their choice from the lesson, and they were to write 3 sentences on the back of how that animal could have been a better citizen. So this lesson now, I realized, lacked many things, one of them being differentiation. As I walked around the classroom during that independent work time for the students, I realized that a lot of them were high ability level learners, and this was kind of an easy task for them to get done very quickly, where a lot of the other learners were the lower level ability learners who those 3 sentences were kind of a struggle, and they needed some more guidance on before doing their independent work. So then I realized I was going to have to change my lesson planning, and I couldn't just teach one lesson to the entire classroom. I would need to include more of the individualized students in my lesson plans. So then I moved on to my evidence number 2, which is a lesson plan for my literacy block. So in this lesson, I want to point out that I use differentiation, and that's the section that I'm going to focus on of this lesson plan. So I have a gearing up and gearing down and ELL activity that I included in this lesson plan. So the gearing up activity is more challenging for those higher level ability learners, where they were asked to do more than what the objective was in the lesson. The gear down was really just an easier version of the lesson where they were asked to do a little bit less than what the objective was to really build their learning before they were moving on to the next objective if they were not ready yet. And then my ELL activity was for the students to come up with an adjective in their L1 and then collaborate with either a peer model student or the teacher and figure out what that adjective also was in English so that they could make the connection between those 2 words and be able to use it in their speaking and writing. Something else I want to point out from this lesson plan is the lesson body and how I structured the lesson in Anita Archer's teaching strategy of I do, we do, you do. So for the I do portion of this lesson, I read a Fancy Nancy book to the students because we were talking about adjectives and those big fancy words that Fancy Nancy uses in her when she speaks and in her stories. So I read that, and that's where I really saw a lot of the students really interested in the topic and hearing those words that they hadn't heard before. And so we talked a lot about those words and their meaning and why she used those fancy words that she does. And then we moved on to the we do stage of the lesson where I really saw most of the children learn. They got with a partner. I matched them up with a higher level student and a lower level student. And in that we do stage, they were to describe something that they knew really, really well to their partner. And they were supposed to use adjectives. They could use these big, unordinary, fancy words that Fancy Nancy uses, but they were really just supposed to describe. And so what I saw during this was those higher level ability learners were really able to spit off a lot of adjectives and a lot of those bigger words, and those lower level students could listen to them, and they were doing things like their dog or something like that. And so if the higher level ability student said, my dog's fluffy and she's this, and those kinds of things, the lower level student was able to be, oh, my dog is fluffy too, and they were able to think of those adjectives as well. So I really saw that growth in all of the students during that we do portion of the lesson in their collaborative conversations. And then I moved on to the you do portion where the students did their independent work at their seats, which is really where I went back and walked around and did more of an informal assessment on who understands what we were talking about and who's ready to move on, and who are those students who maybe need to be retaught or a little more help before we move on to the next objective. So after that, I moved on to my evidence number 3, which is a math unit from my student teaching in 2nd grade. We were in a unit of subtraction where they were learning to subtract from 3-digit numbers. So during this unit, I really focused on diverse learners and the different learning needs of each student. So one of my goals during this lesson, or during this whole unit, was to have the students be able to explain why subtraction works and understand the concept of subtraction rather than just being able to cross out the numbers and borrow and ungroup from the number before. I wanted them to really understand why they could do that. So in order to do this in a classroom of diverse learners, I needed to use multiple teaching strategies. So first, we started off with this proof drawing method, which is hundreds blocks, 10 sticks, and ones. And they started with the first number, so they drew 2 hundreds blocks, and then they needed to cross off 73. But they realized they didn't have 73 to cross off, so they needed to ungroup, so cross out a hundreds block, make it 10 sticks, where they could cross off 70. They still couldn't cross off 3, and so they crossed off 1 10 stick, made 10 ones, and then they were able to finally cross off 73 whole pieces of the proof drawing, and then they could count it up and figure out what that missing partner was. So I have a student example of proof drawings and how the students use proof drawings on their own in their work. And then after the students had a good grasp on proof drawings and how they worked and how they could do subtraction with them, we moved on to this method of make a new 10, which is where if you started with the number 73, you needed to add 7 more ones to get to a new 10 of 80, and then you needed to get to a new 100, you needed to add 20, and then to get to that final number, you needed another 100 to get to 200. Then they could add up those 3 numbers that they added and figure out what that missing partner was as well. But this still really doesn't look like a subtraction problem, so we wanted them to get more into subtraction and what it looks like. But after I introduced that make a new 10 strategy, I had a student come up with his own method, and he called it the timeline method. So this is where I step back as the facilitator of the lesson, and I let him come up and be the facilitator, and he got to teach the students his method of subtraction, and this is his method. This is him using his method of the number line. Okay. So after he taught that, a lot of the students thought it was really cool and they wanted to use his strategy. So they started using his strategy as well. But eventually we moved on from that strategy and moved on to our expanded form. In our expanded form, it's really spreading out those numbers so that they can see when they're subtracting 9 from 7, it's really 90 minus 70. So they could really just see what those numbers represent as they're pushed together in the standard ungroup method. So after they were able to complete that expanded form, we moved on. Oh, I do have a student example of expanded form as well. When she was using the expanded form, she was able to show what each of those values were and then added them all back up at the end to show her final product. And then we moved on to the standard ungroup method, which is that subtraction strategy that we all are used to and all have known since we learned subtraction. So that's the standard ungroup method. And what I found to be really interesting was by the time we got to this method, every time we do subtraction, we talk about why we can cross it out. And almost all of my students in my classroom were able to explain to me why they could cross off that 2 and make it a 1 and make the middle 0 that 9 and then have 10 ones. They were all able to explain why they could do that. And that was the overall goal of the subtraction unit. So I found that to be very successful. So teaching these many different methods, I really saw each student be able to develop their own sense of subtraction in whichever method they preferred, which eventually they all started with that standard ungroup method. So then the big idea in my synthesis, so teaching students with different ability levels in teaching is inevitable. It's really important for the teaching of all students to learn in multiple ways. So not only do a diverse group of students learn more effectively, but they're also more engaged when a topic is something that they need to be paying attention to and figuring out what works best for them. So I saw that with my subtraction. The students were really thinking about what method they use and which one they understood best. So by teaching a diverse learner these multiple teaching strategies, they're able to guide their own learning as well as be more successful when and able to do so. So then in my reflection, so throughout my time at the UNL Teachers College, I've been able to grow as a teacher, developing many different skills to promote teaching. I've learned classroom management strategies, assessment techniques, and differentiation. And I really think I've grown in differentiation and using those multiple teaching strategies in my lessons. So I learned that the components of a successful lesson really develop into teaching that individual student, not necessarily just the whole classroom, which is what I did in my first lesson plan. It didn't really work very well, and I didn't see success amongst the students, so I realized I had to change something, and eventually I have most of my students on board and understanding the topics that are being taught. So that really helped them with those different teaching strategies. And I now know the importance of differentiating subject matter and the benefit that it has for many students. But however, I do know that I'm not done learning, and I never will be. As a teacher, we're always learning. But I have learned a lot more that I could. So from here, I really want to be able to research multiple teaching strategies and find what has been effective in other classrooms and be able to incorporate them into my own classroom and just see how it worked for my classroom and figure out what can work best when I have my very own classroom. And I also want to collaborate with my team members as well and be able to talk to them and see what they use in their classroom just to find what is most effective. But one goal I would like to make for myself is to incorporate technology into my differentiation because students really like to promote their learning and talk about their learning in different forms of media, and technology being one of their favorites and one they like to use. That's something that I would like to incorporate into my differentiation in the future, but I look forward to my future endeavors of becoming a teacher. Thank you.